Hi, Mike again. Today I wanted to talk a little about a part of our history that should never have been forgotten but has long since been lost. It is time to refresh our memories. Black Lives Matter, BLM, does not represent the old civil rights movement. It does not seek equality under the law. And it does not intend to stop until it overthrows the very idea and structure of America as we've known it. Under increasing pressure to acknowledge the dawning reality to which Americans are increasingly waking up, Joe Biden has finally said that looting and arson are, in fact, bad. But Pandora's box has already been opened. The Democrats' vice presidential nominee, Kamala Harris, put us on notice in June. Everyone beware, because they're not going to stop. Everyone should take note of that. They're not going to let up, and they should not, and we should not. What has been forgotten, perhaps because it is often purposely hidden, is that Antifa and BLM both were born from a peculiarly American form of radical and violent Marxism. The actual word used to describe this ideology is in one sense not important. Understanding how those who lead and fund these groups think is what matters. In fact, as soon as one uses the word Marxism today, the activists and intellectuals begin scoffing in disdain. One of the oddities of our time is the staleness of our political rhetoric. This is likely due to the fact that America today includes a greater percentage of older people than it did at any previous time in history. Much of the political language of both Republicans and Democrats is drawn from the Cold War. But it has lost its salience, particularly for those under 50. The American right has long charged the American left with covert Marxism. The young yawn at this, but it is unclear if they know what the charge even means. The very sure people in the upper middle class now double down in denial or worse, contradicting in speech what we see with our own eyes happening across America. In educated, scoffing tones they remark, these protests are not led by violent radicals. Everyone knows the violence comes from white nationalists. Antifa doesn't exist. BLM hardly exists as one united front. BLM is not Marxist. How silly. This is the modern-day civil rights movement. Don't be on the wrong side of history. Besides, says the conflict-averse objector in our heads, the average Democrat is not a Marxist. In fact, the Democratic Party is now the party of American oligarchs, and Marxism in America is generally a watered-down version of anything recognizably Soviet. This is true as far as it goes. But not in the case of Black Lives Matter. The big foundations in America have been funding violent leftist radicals for a long time, and they too are now doubling down, not in denial, like many well-meaning but ignorant or cowardly Americans are, but in their payments to those willing to foment civic unrest. Most Americans still do not realize that what is now occurring on American soil is not an organic civil rights movement, but an elite-funded effort to destabilize the American way of life as we've known it. The complete overhaul of the principles of our justice system to put group identities above equal individual rights, the erosion of private property and private education, and the destruction of traditional families and moral culture. The American media, and many politicians on the American right, have failed to point out to the American people that BLM was created and is led by radical Marxist racialists. Their heroes and teachers are the violent radicals of the 1960s and 70s. As Murray Bassett points out in Listen When They Tell You Who They Are, we know this because they tell us so. They call themselves trained Marxists. This doesn't mean that they merely propose left-leaning economic policies like free healthcare for all. Instead, as Bassett says, they want to destroy the family and abolish private education and private property along with the police. Most Americans still have no idea what they actually stand for. Since America is not racist, most people support the idea that Black Lives Matter, because they believe that in America, all lives matter. But their own lack of racism is being used as a weapon against them. BLM and its elite backers reject both the old civil rights movement and America itself. Even their main public policy prescription, now written in towering letters on our city streets, defund the police, does not reflect the views of over 80% of Black America. Yet BLM and friends now have hundreds of millions of dollars at their command, if not more, and some polls this summer reveal they have become more popular than our major political parties. How did this happen? The fact that versions of Marxism have tried to make inroads in America for over a century is a matter of history, not conspiracy theory. Socialism was making inroads in America in the early part of the last century. The success of presidential candidates like Eugene Debs turned the Democratic Party leftward as Democratic Party figures like Franklin Delano Roosevelt sought to corral their vote. In frustration, the hard left worked for decades on new ways to radicalize America. As Mike Gonzalez reveals in The Selection, he's graciously allowed parts of his new book, The Plot to Change America, How Identity Politics is Dividing the Land of the Free. Marxist intellectuals made the shift from Marxism based on economic classes, that is the worker versus the bourgeois, into one based on immutable characteristics such as race, ethnicity, sex, sexual orientation and even disability status early in the last century. And they brought this version of Marxism to America, from leading intellectuals like Herbert Marcuse personally tutored the Black Panther leader Angela Davis. The same Angela Davis whom Edward Luttwak tells us in The End of the Long March he saw gladly participating in a Soviet Cold War propaganda operation in Finland in the 1960s. The same Angela Davis who owned the weapons used in acts of domestic terrorism in 1970 is a hero and mentor to the founders of BLM. There are many such cases. The BLM movement and their ideas, as Luttwak explains, arise from the old hardcore left, aka the red diaper children and grandchildren and even great-grandchildren of the Stalinist stalwarts of the Communist Party of America, who had themselves been driven to hide below the rocks by the just-in-time McCarthy persecution that removed communists from public life and the trade unions, making it possible for the United States to mobilize for the Cold War. It wasn't until the late 1970s, when finally, at long last, Marxism could sell, in part because the combined effects of globalization and structural change, started impoverishing the less educated half of the American population. During that time, as Luttwak describes, a new generation of the old hardcore left had finally found the weak flank of American society which they could penetrate, subvert, and then dominate, the teaching staff of America's colleges and universities. Besides switching out class for race and other identities as the new framework of the Marxist revolution, they brought a new concept with them, white privilege. As Kyle Shidler reveals in The Communist Roots of White Privilege, communists Theodore Ted Allen and Noel Ignatiev, aka Noel Ignatin, invented and taught the concept because they thought that the white working class would never be compelled to rebel as long as they accepted their white skin privilege. This novel idea was taken up by the radical violent left, including the Weather Underground, perhaps the most famous leftist domestic terrorism group in living memory. Today this racialist concept and its accompanying struggle sessions, in which participants must renounce their evil whiteness, is mandated by government, education, and the corporate world throughout the United States. These early groups from the 60s and 70s helped shape BLM and Antifa's tactics on our streets today. Many an academic has revealed their surprise at how tightly BLM and friends cling to Stokely Carmichael's Black Power, written in 1967, which was one of the first books to set forth the poorly constructed ideology we are witnessing play out today. Carmichael, who famously broke with the Black Panthers for allying with white people, went to Africa soon after writing his manifesto and founded the All-African People's Revolutionary Party. Consider Assata Shakur, the Black Liberation Army fighter who escaped to Cuba from a life sentence for murder. Shakur is a hero to BLM activists, who have posted pictures of themselves wearing t-shirts that say Assata taught me. Such shirts are often sold by vendors who sell BLM-related merchandise, and BLM teaches its foot soldiers to chant Shakur's words while protesting. Convicted terrorist Susan Rosenberg, once a part of the Weather Underground, ended up on the board of directors for the fundraising arm of BLM. This was possible because Bill Clinton pardoned her, letting her out of prison after she served only 16 years of what was originally a 58-year sentence. Even if figures like Davis, Allen, Ignatiev, and the unrepentant Weather Underground terrorist Bill Ayers were sometimes complicit in violence, they generally went unpunished. Instead, they taught rising generations of young minds. That's right, instead of jail time, all of the above got tenure. Ignatiev even taught for a time at Harvard. Instead of being ostracized from polite company, many of these domestic terrorists became friends with the likes of Barack Obama, as Ayers did, and were celebrated in elite circles. After the Soviet Union collapsed, they still made the occasional trek to countries like Venezuela, meeting dictators like Hugo Chavez. Daniel DiMartino is a freedom fighter who grew up in Venezuela. As he says in Venezuelan Socialists Come for America, his country's history is an important story for Americans to know because both peaceful and violent protests have been organized by groups whose intention is to impose socialism a la Venezuela in the United States. As Martino notes, BLM and friends have met and praised Chavez's successor, Nicolás Maduro. Flush with cash, cultural cash, and elite protection, they are now implementing Chavez's playbook on American streets today. The central problem, however, for BLM and its parent organizations is an old one. Marxism could never quite take hold in America due to a recalcitrant middle class. The concept of white privilege is one way to deal with the problem. Kevin Porteous outlines another. The result is an imported revolutionary class. And although to be sure, as Alberto M. Fernandez argues in The Communist LARP, this is a developing mass movement, it is nevertheless funded, led, staffed, and allowed by American elites and the institutions they control. American elites of both parties have forced mass immigration on the American people over and against the will of the voters for decades now. It is the single biggest issue for Trump supporters. But it is in the elite's financial interest to import cheap and easily manipulated labor, waves of the desperate and impoverished, as well as higher-end workers, ensure they can pay American workers less. It is also in the political interest of the Democratic Party, which captures the vote of the impoverished, giving them increasing political dominance and creating one-party oligarchies, as in California. To ensure the success of their project, the contemporary left has abandoned all pretense of concern for American sovereignty and the integrity of America's international borders, and has embraced a policy of unlimited mass migration, combined with the demand that America accept countless refugee migrants from the undeveloped and developing world. Concerns about drug trafficking, human trafficking, infectious diseases, gang violence, and terrorism are swept aside with arguments that any attempt to limit entry into the United States is racist and un-American. But immigration also helps the racialist Marxists, who have grown exponentially in power over the last 2 decades. They have now achieved what their teachers and mentors could never dream of, a violent, destabilizing insurrection masquerading as a popular civil rights movement with the support of a major political party and nearly every major cultural institution in the nation. The establishment left still thinks it can control the movement, but it is clear what will happen to them if they do not. There's a reason protesters keep putting guillotines outside of Jeff Bezos' house. As Peter Myers explains, the present ascendancy of the woke left on race is no triumph for civil rights, nor for social justice or any sort of justice, nor for democratic government, which this movement opposes. What BLM truly wants is a new America. An America ruled by a racial version of Marxism, a confederation of identity groups, especially of racialized identity groups, where moral authority and its ensuing social advantages are apportioned according to the relative strength of group claims to past and present aggrievement. Jim Crow, in other words, but in reverse. The government, of course, will be in their hands and the laws will be ordered accordingly. BLM utterly rejects the notion of equality under the law. They wish to enact a system of law and culture in which people will be judged by their race and sexual identity, not insofar as they are equally human. As Myers points out, the ruling principle is disintegration, not integration, discord, not harmony, war, not peace. To persist on this path is to push the republic ever closer to their dissolution or despotism. And here we are. BLM and its associates, despite being the direct descendants of Marxist domestic terrorists, despite rejecting the principles of America itself, and despite holding views that are not even representative of the people they purport to represent, now have the resources and path they need to wreak the havoc they have been planning for years. They have already succeeded in causing more chaos than their intellectual parents. As ever, the Democratic Party refuses to oust or reject them from its ranks with vigor. Worse, outside of President Trump, many in the Republican Party are still too cowardly to denounce them, even as America burns. Our failure to stop this movement decades ago is what led us to this moment. Now, we have no choice. It is time to stop pretending that BLM and Antifa are anything other than domestic terrorist groups led by radicals who seek to rip America apart. Of course, many if not most of those protesting today by simply marching in the streets have little understanding of the ideology driving the organizers and the worst of their trained foot soldiers. But that's how revolutions work. BLM is what it claims to be, a racialist Marxist group that seeks to completely alter the American way of life. They have more power and resources now than any insurrectionary movement in American history. They will not stop until they are stopped. This should not be a partisan issue. But if our political leaders on the right and left continue to refuse to specifically call them out for what they are and directly oppose them, America will continue to burn. Marxism is on the rise, socialism is here and communism is closer than you think. If you want more information about where America is heading, register for Nehemiah Reset's webinar on socialism, communism, and Marxism. The webinar will be held Thursday, August 19, 2021, at 6:30 p.m. You can register by going to nehemiahreset.org/event listing and clicking on the related image and the registration link at the bottom of the article. If the webinar event date is already passed, you can see a recorded video of the webinar by going to nehemiahreset.org/webinars and clicking on the socialism image. All Americans need to understand where things are going if we don't change our actions. The only way this will change is to stand up against these Marxist movements and our progressive school boards and city councils. Our public schools and, even some of our private schools, are teaching critical race theory, BLM curriculum, the 1610 Project lies and pushing equity on our students. Conservative parents need to run for school boards, city councils and stand up against the progressive agenda being used to indoctrinate our students. There is a reason test scores in the United States have fallen in recent years. Traditional education has been replaced by indoctrination. This cannot be tolerated. Take time to stand with other parents pushing against this indoctrination. I hope this video has been helpful to you in explaining where we are and why all of us need to take action. I hope to see you on our next webinar educating parents about what is happening in our culture and in our schools. Have a wonderful day and continue to pray for our country and our leaders.